During the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire appears, in retrospect, as an already cracked giant, but in 213 none of the protagonists have the sensation of experiencing the beginning of the end. The barbarian invasions, which modern historiography tends to read as a unitary and overwhelming phenomenon, are therefore a sequence of local, intermittent crises, faced with tools that Rome knows well: armies, forts, negotiations, reprisals. The border is not an abstract line drawn on maps, but an inhabited strip, traveled and observed day and night. Before Caracalla's campaigns against the Alamanni, Quadi and Carpi, the Roman world of the Rhine and the Danube lived in an unstable equilibrium, made up of consolidated customs and growing tensions, in which war was not an exceptional event, but an ever-present possibility, almost a form of armed dialogue between Rome and the peoples pressing on its margins. At the end of the 2nd century, the empire has just overcome one of the toughest tests in its recent history. The Marcomannic wars fought by Marcus Aurelius along the Danube have brutally shown how vulnerable the northern border is when multiple barbarian populations manage to coordinate and strike in depth. Those wars ended without an irreparable disaster, but they left a heavy legacy. Entire Danube regions were devastated. Many Roman communities experienced the eruption of war in the countryside and cities for the first time, and the army had to adapt to a more mobile, less ritualized type of conflict than that of the wars of conquest of the past. When, a few decades later, Septimius Severus came to power, attention to the army and the borders became an absolute political priority. Severus reorganizes the armed forces, increases the soldiers' pay, and ties the fate of the emperor more closely to that of the legions. It is a choice that strengthens the state in the short term, but which also contributes to making the army the true arbiter of imperial political life. On the Rhine, the situation appears, at least on the surface, relatively stable. The Germanic limes, with its network of forts, watchtowers, and military roads, is the product of over a century of Roman presence. The legions are stationed in permanent bases, the cities in the rear prosper thanks to trade and military supplies, and the Germanic populations beyond the border are used to dealing with Rome through a mixture of exchanges, temporary alliances, and raids. The Alamanni, who began to emerge as a confederation between the end of the 2nd and the beginning of the 3rd century, are not a unitary people in the Roman sense of the term, but a fluid set of warrior groups capable of quickly uniting under charismatic leaders when the opportunity to strike arises. Their strength does not lie in discipline or the ability to sustain prolonged campaigns, but in speed, knowledge of the territory, and the possibility of suddenly concentrating armed men where the border appears weakest. On the Danube, the picture is even more complex. Here Rome faces populations that already have a long history of contacts, both peaceful and violent, with the empire. The Quadi, settled north of the Middle Danube, have been well known to the Romans since the time of Augustus and fought against Marcus Aurelius stubbornly. They are not improvised barbarians, but adversaries who know Roman tactics, who have learned to exploit the rivers as routes of penetration and who know when it is time to negotiate and when to fight. Further east, the Carpi represent a more elusive threat. Settled between the Carpathians and the lower Danube, they are less integrated into Roman diplomatic mechanisms and more prone to rapid and destructive incursions. Their presence reminds Roman commanders that the Danube border is not a continuous barrier, but a succession of strong points separated by spaces that are difficult to control. In this context, daily life along the limes is made up of armed normality. The soldiers man the forts, patrol the roads, guard the river fords. Many of them now originate from the same border regions, Romanized provincials, sometimes descendants of barbarians enlisted a generation or two earlier. They speak Latin with different accents. They know the customs of the people across the river, and they know that peace can last for years, but also break in one night. Civilian communities live in the shadow of the garrisons, benefiting from Roman protection but also exposed to the risks of being the first victims of an incursion. The sources give us a world in which the border is permeable, crossed by merchants, emissaries, deserters, spies, and in which the clear distinction between Roman and barbarian is often more ideological than real. Politically, the empire enters the 3rd century with a still solid structure, but with signs of growing tension. Dynastic succession is never completely certain, and every emperor knows that the consent of the army is decisive. Caracalla, son of Septimius Severus, inherits this system and pushes it to the extreme. Even before waging war on the Alamanni and the Danubian peoples, Caracalla governs an empire that has chosen to invest enormously in the armed forces, implicitly accepting that internal stability depends on the ability to keep soldiers loyal and satisfied. This also means that any sign of weakness on the border can have disastrous political consequences. A defeat is not just a military problem, but a direct risk to imperial power. The news of barbaric movements along the Rhine and the Danube, of minor incursions, of increasingly frequent pressure on the borders, are therefore not simply marginal episodes. They are alarm bells ringing in the imperial chancelleries and in the headquarters of the legions. Provincial governors send reports, ask for reinforcements, propose preventive actions. The idea of a defensive war, conducted not to conquer new territories but to re-establish a favorable balance, emerged as a necessity. Even before Caracalla decides to personally lead the operations, the Roman military apparatus prepares for a possible conflict, strengthening the garrisons, accumulating supplies, improving the military roads connecting the Rhine to the Danube. It is a machine that does not start suddenly, but lives in a state of permanent alert. In this scenario, the barbarian populations are not passive spectators. Even beyond the border, Rome is observed carefully. The Alamanni, Quadi and Carpi leaders evaluate the signals coming from the empire. Changes of command, movements of troops, rumors of internal power struggles. They know that Rome is strong, but they also know that it is vast and that it cannot be everywhere at the same time. The incursions do not arise out of nowhere, but are often the result of political calculations, demographic pressures, and opportunities seized at the right time. Before Caracalla's campaigns, the barbarian world was crossed by its own dynamics, by temporary alliances and internal rivalries, which made the border a place of continuous armed negotiation. Thus, on the eve of 213, the picture that emerges is that of an empire still capable of reacting decisively, but forced to do so more and more often. The Rhine and the Danube are not peaceful frontiers suddenly overwhelmed by barbarism, but contact zones where peace is fragile and war is a structural possibility. Caracalla's campaigns will not arise from a sudden isolated aggression, but from this long accumulation of tensions, from a recent history made up of clashes, adaptations, and compromises. Before the storm, the Roman border was already living in a state of permanent unrest, and the empire, even without openly admitting it, knew it had to demonstrate its strength once again to continue to be feared, respected and, above all, obeyed. When Caracalla promulgated the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212, extending Roman citizenship to almost all the free inhabitants of the empire, the gesture appeared less revolutionary to his contemporaries than it would to modern historians. It is not the idealistic act of an enlightened sovereign, but a decision deeply linked to war, taxation, and the army. Making everyone citizens means broadening the tax base, but above all strengthening the legal and symbolic bond between the state and millions of potentially enlistable men. In an era where border pressure is growing and military campaigns are increasingly frequent, the empire needs soldiers, resources, and an ideology that justifies the ongoing war effort. Caracalla governs with this awareness, and his gaze is constantly turned to the military camps, rather than to the palaces of civil power. The emperor is not an improvised commander. Raised in camps, educated in the discipline of the legions, Caracalla internalized the Severian idea according to which the prince is first and foremost a soldier among soldiers. The often hostile sources insist on his brutality and his obsession with Alexander the Great, but behind these caricatures we glimpse a sovereign who knows well the functioning of the Roman military apparatus and who exploits every lever to consolidate his power. The increase in wages, extraordinary donations, tolerance towards a harsher but also more autonomous discipline are political tools even before military ones. The army, under Caracalla, is not only the defender of the borders, but the very pillar of imperial legitimacy. The news arriving from the northern borders in the first years of his reign did not indicate an imminent catastrophe, but painted a picture of growing restlessness. On the Rhine, the Alamanni groups are more daring, crossing the river in small contingents, testing the defenses, sacking isolated villages, and quickly retreating. On the Danube, the Quadi and especially the Carpi intensified their incursions, taking advantage of the vastness of the front and the difficulty of coordination between the different garrisons. These are not yet large-scale invasions, but constant pressure that risks eroding Roman authority if it is not tackled decisively. In this context, Caracalla makes a significant choice. He does not delegate the response to the provincial governors alone, but decides to personally bring the war to the border. The preparation of the campaign is neither improvised nor rapid. The Roman apparatus moves according to proven procedures, which require time and coordination. The legions stationed in the Rhenish provinces are strengthened. Some units are moved from quieter sectors, while auxiliary contingents are recalled or recruited from scratch. Logistics, as always, is the true heart of the operation. Military roads are repaired, bridges consolidated, warehouses filled with grain, weapons, and equipment. The movement of an emperor with his retinue implies the mobilization of an enormous administrative machine. Officials, servants, pack animals, artisans follow the army, transforming the march towards the north into a slow but inexorable advance of Roman power. Caracalla chose to move towards the Rhine in 213, presenting the operation as a necessary punitive action against the barbarian incursions. Imperial propaganda insists on the theme of the defense of the provinces and the safety of the subjects, but the message intended for the soldiers is even clearer. The emperor is with them, shares the risks, leads the army in person. The sources tell of a Caracalla wearing military equipment, taking part in the marches, and speaking directly to the troops. Beyond the rhetorical emphasis, these gestures have a concrete value in a political system in which the physical presence of the prince on the battlefield strengthens cohesion and reduces the risk of disaffection. From a strategic point of view, the choice to start from the Rhine front responds to a precise logic. The Alamanni represent an immediate but limited threat, and striking them quickly means re-establishing Roman authority in a region crucial to the connections between Gaul and Italy. Furthermore, a victorious campaign on the Rhine can also act as a deterrent for the Danube populations, showing that the empire is still capable of reacting with strength and speed. Caracalla and his military advisors do not seek a stable territorial conquest beyond the river, but a demonstration of superiority, achieved through deep raids, targeted devastation and the elimination of the most dangerous leaders. Meanwhile, Roman generals play an essential, often invisible role in emperor-centered narratives. The legionary legates, the commanders of the auxiliary troops, the praetorian prefects coordinate movements, collect information, manage relations with the local elites. The war on the border is not just armed conflict, but also intelligence, force diplomacy, negotiation with groups willing to collaborate. Some barbarian leaders seek agreements, offer hostages, promise loyalty in exchange for gifts or a truce. Others choose resistance, counting on the fragmentation of the front and the possibility of avoiding a decisive clash. Rome, faithful to its tradition, exploits both options, alternating an outstretched hand with the harshest repression. The presence of the emperor also changes the pace of the war. Decisions are made more quickly, but they are also loaded with a strong symbolic value. Every victory, even minor, is celebrated, every defeat minimized or silenced. The inscriptions, the coins, the official reports begin to build the image of an invincible Caracalla, protector of the borders and avenger of the offenses suffered by Rome. This narrative is not pure empty propaganda. It serves to strengthen the morale of the troops and to reassure the populations of the provinces, who see in the emperor a tangible presence, not a distant and abstract authority. At the same time, the preparation of the campaign reveals the transformations taking place in the Roman army. The legions of the 3rd century are no longer those of the great conquests, but more flexible forces, supported by a growing number of specialized auxiliary units. Light cavalry, archers, troops recruited from the border populations themselves become indispensable tools to face a mobile enemy that is difficult to locate. Caracalla inherits and consolidates this evolution, aware that the war against the Alamanni and, subsequently, against the Danubian peoples will require speed of movement and the ability to adapt more than large-pitched battles. While the army concentrates on the Rhine, something is moving beyond the border too. The Alamanni groups perceive the change in scale. It is no longer a question of facing individual garrisons or local punitive expeditions, but the direct intervention of the emperor with substantial forces. Some choose to retreat into the depths of the forests, others prepare for battle, trusting in the Roman difficulty of operating in a hostile territory. The war that is about to begin has not yet been fought, but it is already present in the decisions, preparations, and expectations of both sides. Thus, on the eve of operations, the picture is clear. Caracalla decided to tie his political destiny to a show of military strength. The army is ready, the resources have been mobilized, the Rhine border has become the center of the imperial scene. It is not yet the time for battles and marches through enemy territories, but that of choices that will make the clash inevitable. In this phase, the war already exists as a project, as a political and military construction, and the Roman Empire, still powerful and self-confident, is preparing to compete with an enemy that does not threaten its immediate existence, but which tests, day after day, its ability to govern a world too vast to experience lasting peace. During 213, the empire's attention was definitively focused on the Rhine, not as a symbolic line of separation, but as a concrete operational space in which political will, military capabilities, and knowledge of the territory were measured. The Rhenish front does not offer spectacular scenarios of large pitched battles, but a fragmented environment, dominated by secondary rivers, dense forests, irregular hills, and a network of military roads that connect the Roman forts like nodes in a chain always under tension. It is in this space that Caracalla conducts his first real military test as emperor, a campaign that does not aim to expand the borders, but to reassert control and break the enemy's initiative. The Alamanni do not present themselves as a unitary army lined up in front of the legions, but as a constellation of armed groups, capable of striking quickly and dissolving just as quickly. To be effective, the Roman response must adapt to this reality, renouncing the search for a decisive clash in favor of continuous and widespread pressure. The imperial army moves along the Rhine with prudence and method. The legions do not advance in depth without securing the rear, and each movement is accompanied by the strengthening of existing outposts. Forts are replenished, garrisons increased, watchtowers restored where necessary. Control of the river is fundamental. Naval patrols monitor the most sensitive sections, preventing sudden crossings and ensuring the flow of supplies. Caracalla follows these operations closely, aware that the war on the border cannot be won with a single blow, but with the ability to make every initiative of the enemy costly. Its presence on the ground strengthens the authority of local commanders and accelerates decision-making, reducing the uncertainties that often paralyze defensive operations. The Alamanni react in a predictable and at the same time difficult to counter. They avoid direct clash with the legionary masses, preferring to strike isolated detachments, supply convoys, and unfortified villages. Their strength lies in their knowledge of the terrain and their ability to exploit every gap left by the Roman defense. However, this very strategy exposes them to a systematic response. Auxiliary troops, in particular cavalry and light units, take on a central role. They chase, intercept, force Alamanni groups to fight in unfavorable conditions or to disperse. The war becomes a sequence of minor clashes, ambushes, reprisals, in which Roman organizational superiority progressively emerges. Caracalla does not limit himself to directing operations from the rear. The sources insist on his direct involvement, sometimes emphasized by propaganda, but not without foundation. The emperor inspects the forts, speaks to the troops, witnesses the deployments. This behavior has a concrete effect on the morale of the soldiers, who see in the prince not a distant administrator, but a commander willing to share the hardships of the campaign. In an era in which imperial authority is increasingly linked to the perception of military strength, these gestures help consolidate the loyalty of the army, reducing the risk of discontent or usurpations. At the same time, the presence of the emperor makes every success immediately usable on a symbolic level, strengthening the image of a Rome still capable of imposing its own will. From a strategic point of view, the Roman objective is not the stable occupation of the territory beyond the Rhine, but the creation of an area of insecurity for the Alamanni. Punitive raids hit villages, destroy food reserves, capture prisoners. It is a harsh form of warfare, which aims to break the enemy's ability to sustain offensive operations in the short term. Some Alamanni leaders seek contact with Roman commanders, offering temporary submission or hostages in exchange for a cessation of hostilities. Rome accepts these agreements when it is convenient, but considers them temporary tools, useful for dividing the opposing front and gaining time. Diplomacy, as is often the case on the border, is inseparable from the constant threat of force. Roman generals play a decisive role in translating imperial will into concrete action. They coordinate the legions with auxiliary units, manage the information collected by explorers and local informants, plan movements that take into account the characteristics of the terrain. War against the Alamanni requires a flexibility that the Roman army, despite its reputation for rigidity, has developed over decades of border conflicts. The legionary columns advance only when conditions are favorable, while the light troops operate on the edges, maintaining constant contact with the enemy. It is a war of attrition, in which discipline and the ability to maintain cohesion make the difference. As the months pass, the combined effect of the Roman operations becomes evident. Alamannic incursions decrease in intensity and frequency, and the border appears progressively more secure. This does not mean that the threat is eliminated, but that the initiative is firmly back in the hands of Rome. The strengthened and better coordinated forts along the Rhine serve as a basis for more effective surveillance. Military roads guarantee a speed of intervention that discourages isolated enemy actions. The campaign does not produce spectacular conquests, but it achieves the main objective, re-establishing a balance favorable to the empire. Imperial propaganda presents these results as a clear victory. Caracalla takes on honorific titles, coins celebrate the subjugation of the Germans, and official accounts emphasize the emperor's role as defender of the provinces. Behind this triumphal representation, the reality is more nuanced. The Alamanni are not annihilated, nor definitively tamed. They remain beyond the border, ready to take up arms again when conditions allow. However, for the moment, Rome has shown that it can react with strength and speed, and this message has a value that goes beyond the Rhine front. The conclusion of operations on the Rhine does not mark the end of the campaign, but its transformation. Caracalla and his general staff are aware that the pressure on the Danube has not diminished and that a show of force in one sector must be followed by an intervention in the other, to prevent the enemy from taking advantage of the shift in Roman attention. The war, at this stage, is a balancing act between different fronts, in which local success must be quickly capitalized on the broader strategic plan. The Rhine, temporarily pacified, becomes the starting point for a new phase of operations. Thus, the campaign against the Alamanni in 213 ended without a symbolic date or a sensational final event. It gradually runs out, while the army prepares to move men and resources towards the Danube. The Rhine border remains manned, strengthened, but never definitively secure. The experience of this war confirms a truth that Roman commanders know well. Border control is not a permanent state, but a continuous process, which requires presence, strength, and a constant ability to adapt. Caracalla emerges from this first military test with sufficient success to consolidate his authority, but also with the awareness that the empire will have to fight again, and soon, to maintain that fragile balance that separates apparent peace from open war. When operations on the Rhine slow down and the Alamanni initiative appears contained, the attention of the Roman command quickly shifts eastward. This is not a simple change of scenery, but a strategic decision that reveals the very nature of border warfare in the 3rd century. A shifting equilibrium, in which every sector left uncovered risks becoming immediately vulnerable. The Danube, longer, more fragmented, and more difficult to control than the Rhine, has long been the point of greatest concern. The news reaching the headquarters speaks of irregular movements, of growing pressure exerted by the Quadi and above all by the Carpi, of provincial communities forced to live in a permanent state of alarm. Caracalla understands that a victory, or even just a show of strength, on the Rhine is not enough if it is not accompanied by a decisive intervention on the second great northern front of the empire. The transfer of the strategic center of gravity is not an improvised operation. Moving a Roman army means moving tens of thousands of men, animals, chariots, supplies, weapons, officials. The legions do not march as a compact and disorderly mass, but follow studied itineraries, taking advantage of the imperial road network that connects the Germanic provinces to the Danube ones. Logistics once again becomes the true silent protagonist of the campaign. The warehouses are emptied and refilled in a chain, the rear cities take on the role of sorting nodes, the local authorities are called upon to provide supplies and support. Each stage of the transfer is planned to avoid bottlenecks and to ensure that the troops arrive at the new front in adequate operational conditions. During this phase, the Roman army offers a show of organized power that affects both its subjects and potential enemies. The marching columns cross territories that have long been pacified, but not without tension. The provincial populations observe the passage of the troops with mixed feelings. On the one hand, the reassurance that comes from the presence of the emperor and the legions, on the other, the concrete weight of the requisitions and logistical obligations. War, even when fought far away, always leaves deep traces in the daily life of the provinces. Caracalla, aware of this impact, moves in balance between the need to maintain military efficiency and that of not completely alienating the consensus of the local communities. On a military level, the move towards the Danube implies a reorganization of forces. Not all units deployed on the Rhine are moved. Some remain to guard the border, to guarantee the newly re-established stability. Others are redistributed, integrated with contingents already allocated in the Danube provinces. This process of rotation and concentration demonstrates the flexibility of the Roman army, capable of quickly adapting to changing strategic needs. Commanders must coordinate troops that have not always operated together, harmonizing procedures, chains of command, and operational methods. It is a complex job, which requires experience and authority, and which is facilitated by the direct presence of the emperor. The Danube, unlike the Rhine, is not just a natural barrier, but a complex river system, with numerous tributaries, bends, and sections that are difficult to monitor. The Roman forts, spaced along the river, act as control points, but between them there are large areas where control is more lax. The Quadi, based north of the Middle Danube, know these weaknesses well. They learned, during previous wars, to exploit moments of transition, when Roman troops were on the move or concentrated elsewhere. The Carpi, further east, added a further element of instability, with rapid incursions hitting less protected sectors and retreating before the Roman response could fully organize. Caracalla addresses this complexity with a strategy that combines deterrence and targeted intervention. Even before entering openly hostile territory, the Roman army strengthens its positions along the river. The forts are replenished and, where necessary, expanded, the garrisons increased, improved communications. The river fleet takes on a central role, guaranteeing control of the waters and rapid transfers of men and materials. The Danube is not just a line to defend, but a communication route that Rome exploits to maintain its logistical superiority. At this stage, war is still largely a matter of preparation and psychological pressure. The presence of the emperor and a large army has an immediate effect on the people across the river. The Quadi and Carpi leaders must decide whether to face the Roman power directly or seek alternative solutions. Some send embassies, offering promises of peace, tribute, or cooperation. Others prefer to maintain a wait-and-see attitude, hoping that the empire, as has already happened in the past, will limit itself to a show of strength without going too far. Rome, for its part, listens but does not trust. Previous experiences have taught us that truces on the Danube are often temporary, useful for buying time rather than guaranteeing lasting peace. The figure of Caracalla, in this context, takes on a value that goes beyond the purely military one. The emperor presents himself as judge and arbiter, as the one who can grant or deny peace. This role strengthens the political dimension of the campaign and contributes to building the image of a still strong central power. The decisions made at this stage are not always documented in detail by the sources, but their effect is perceptible in the relative stabilization of the front as the army completes its deployment. War, once again, is made up of both what happens and what is avoided. The transfer towards the Danube also marks a moment of reflection for the Roman command. The experiences on the Rhine have shown the effectiveness of a strategy of continuous pressure and targeted interventions. Applying the same model on a larger and more complex front requires adaptations. The distances are greater, the enemies more diverse, the terrain more difficult. However, the Roman army has a fundamental advantage: the ability to sustain prolonged operations thanks to a logistical and administrative structure unmatched in the ancient world. It is this ability, even more than the number of soldiers or the quality of weapons, that constitutes Rome's true strength. As the army concentrates along the Danube, time plays an ambiguous role. Every day spent without direct clashes can be read as a sign of deterrent success, but also as an opportunity for the enemy to prepare. The Roman commanders are aware of this risk and try to maintain the initiative, carrying out reconnaissance, demonstrations of force, movements that prevent the Quadi and Carpi from feeling safe. The war, in this phase, does not yet explode into decisive battles, but manifests itself as a constant tension, a silent tug-of-war in which every gesture is observed and interpreted. Thus, the passage from the Rhine to the Danube is not a simple geographical transition, but a key moment in Caracalla's campaign. The empire demonstrates that it can rapidly shift its center of gravity, that it is not tied to a single front, and that it still possesses that strategic mobility that had been one of the secrets of its success in previous centuries. At the same time, this need to continually move reveals the fragility of a system forced to intervene everywhere to maintain a balance that can no longer stand on its own. The Danube now awaits the full arrival of the war, and with it a new test for the Roman army and for the emperor who chose to link his name to the armed and incessant defense of the borders of the empire. When the Roman army completes its deployment along the Danube between the end of 213 and the beginning of 214, the war enters a harsher and less predictable phase than that fought on the Rhine. Here the enemy is not just one, nor does he act according to a uniform model. The Quadi and the Carpi represent two distinct problems, which overlap in the same operational space and force the Roman command to continuously modulate its responses. The Danube does not separate two clearly opposing worlds, but crosses a contact region in which populations, interests, and violence have been intertwined for decades. The presence of the emperor does not erase this complexity, but makes it more evident, because every choice immediately takes on a political as well as military weight. The Quadi are familiar adversaries, almost familiar in their hostility. They fought against Marcus Aurelius, they suffered defeats and made agreements, they learn to recognize the signs of Roman strength and those of its hesitation. They do not seek a head-on clash except when conditions seem favorable, but they exert constant pressure, made up of threats, limited incursions, calibrated provocations. Their goal is not to destroy the empire, but to gain space, loot, recognition. The Carpi, on the contrary, are perceived as a more disturbing element. Less inserted into traditional diplomatic networks, more mobile and less predictable, they mainly strike the eastern sectors of the front, exploiting the difficulties of coordination and the vastness of the territory. Their action contributes to creating a sense of widespread insecurity, which forces Rome to disperse its forces. Caracalla faces this situation with a strategy that rejects passivity. The Roman army did not limit itself to garrisoning the river, but crossed it, bringing the war into enemy territory. The operations do not follow a single axis, but develop along multiple lines, with the aim of preventing barbarian groups from concentrating or striking undisturbed. The legions advance in a controlled manner, supported by auxiliary troops who play an essential role in patrolling and reconnaissance. The cavalry, in particular, becomes a decisive tool for pursuing retreating groups and protecting the flanks of the main columns. The war on the Danube is a war of movement, in which speed and the ability to react quickly count as much as brute force. The sources do not give us a detailed chronicle of each clash, but they allow us to reconstruct the general character of the operations. There are no major decisive battles, but a series of offensive and punitive actions that aim to break the enemy's ability to resist. Villages are burned, crops destroyed, prisoners captured. It is a harsh strategy, which affects not only the warriors, but the entire social structure of the opposing communities. Rome knows that, to re-establish control, it must make it too costly to continue the war. At the same time, avoid going too deep, aware of the risks of isolation and ambush in little-known territories. Roman generals operate with a certain autonomy, coordinating with the emperor but adapting general directives to local conditions. The chain of command must be flexible, because information often arrives fragmentedly and with inevitable delays. Decisions are made in the field, based on reconnaissance, interrogations of prisoners, reports from scouts. It is in this context that the competence of the Roman military elite emerges, capable of managing a complex war without losing cohesion. The presence of Caracalla guarantees the political unity of the operation, but success depends to a large extent on the efficiency of subordinate commanders and the discipline of the troops. The Quadi, under increasing pressure, oscillate between resistance and negotiation. Some leaders try to limit the damage, offering hostages or promising loyalty in exchange for a truce. Rome welcomes these initiatives with caution, using them to divide the enemy front and to gain time. The Carpi, however, continue to represent a more elusive threat. Their incursions, although successfully thwarted on multiple occasions, demonstrate how difficult it is to completely eliminate an enemy that offers no stable target. The war against them takes on the characteristics of a relentless hunt, in which success is often temporary and requires constant vigilance. From an operational point of view, the Roman army made the most of the Danube as a logistical axis. River ships transport troops, supplies, and messages, allowing a speed of intervention that surprises adversaries. Forts along the river serve as forward bases, from which targeted expeditions launch and to which units can quickly return. This system allows Roma to maintain continuous pressure without exposing themselves excessively. It is a demonstration of that organizational superiority which, still in the 3rd century, distinguished the empire from its enemies. Caracalla, as he had done on the Rhine, also uses the campaign on a symbolic level. The victories, however limited, are presented as evidence of restored border security. The emperor shows himself as the guarantor of order, as the one who brought the war back across the river, away from the provinces. This message is aimed both at the subjects and the soldiers, and helps to strengthen the image of a central power still capable of controlling the situation. However, behind the official rhetoric, the reality remains complex. The Danube is not definitively pacified, and the barbarian populations are not irreversibly defeated. As the operations proceed, it becomes clear that the Roman objective is not the total annihilation of the Quadi and Carpi, but the restoration of an acceptable balance. War, in this context, is an instrument of regulation, not of conquest. Rome aims to reduce pressure on the border, to discourage incursions, to reaffirm its ability to intervene. As these results begin to appear, the intensity of operations gradually decreases. The troops remain deployed, ready to intervene, but the pace of fighting drops, a sign that deterrence is working, at least temporarily. The Danube campaign of 214 does not offer a spectacular ending, but it leaves a profound impression. It demonstrates that the empire is still capable of coordinating complex operations on a vast front, of moving its army quickly, of striking decisively. At the same time, it highlights the structural limitations of this system. Every success requires enormous effort, every stabilization is fragile, every truce is temporary. The war against the Quadi and the Carpi does not close one phase, but inaugurates another, in which the Danube border remains a permanent line of tension. Caracalla can present himself as the winner, and in part he is, but the price of this victory is the awareness that peace along the Danube will never again be a natural condition, but rather the temporary result of a constantly exerted force. While the operations along the Danube stabilize and the immediate pressure of the enemies is contained, another level of Caracalla's campaign clearly emerges, less visible but no less decisive: the transformation and strengthening of the Roman military apparatus in response to a war that is no longer episodic, but structural. The conflict fought against the Alamanni, Quadi and Carpi is not perceived as a parenthesis, but rather as a signal of what awaits the empire in the years to come. The Roman army, already profoundly changed compared to that of previous centuries, continues to adapt, not through proclaimed reforms, but through practical adjustments, dictated by direct experience on the front. It is in this phase that Caracalla's campaign reveals its deepest meaning, going beyond the chronicle of operations to impact the very way in which Rome conceives the defense of the borders. The first obvious element is the strengthening of the defensive structures. The forts along the Rhine and the Danube are no longer just static garrisons, but become active nodes of a continuous control system. Garrisons are increased, buildings renovated, walls strengthened. Where the terrain allows, small but well-connected forward outposts are created, intended to promptly report any suspicious movement across the river. This is not a new defensive line in the traditional sense, but a densification of the Roman presence, which aims to reduce the enemy's room for maneuver. This strategy does not eliminate the risk, but makes it more manageable, transforming the border into a deeply monitored area. At the same time, the army is being prepared for a war different from that of the past. The legions remain the fundamental nucleus, but their use is increasingly integrated with that of the auxiliary troops. The latter are no longer simple complements, but essential components of the military device. Cavalry, archers, light units recruited in border regions or among recently subjugated populations take on a central role in patrolling, pursuit, and reconnaissance operations. Their knowledge of the terrain and greater mobility compensate for the relative slowness of legionary formations, allowing Rome to react more quickly to sudden incursions. This integration, already started previously, was further consolidated during Caracalla's campaigns, which show how indispensable it is in a fragmented war scenario. Army preparation is not just about structures and units, but also about mentality. The soldiers of the 3rd century are trained for a harder, less regulated war, in which the enemy does not always accept head-on confrontation and in which the distinction between combatant and non-combatant is often blurred. Discipline remains ironclad, but is accompanied by greater operational autonomy, especially for intermediate-level commanders. The campaigns on the Rhine and the Danube demonstrate that effectiveness depends on the ability to make quick decisions on the ground, without waiting for orders from above. This process, favored by the presence of an emperor who favored military efficiency, contributed to making the army more flexible, but also more aware of its political weight. Caracalla encourages this evolution in a manner consistent with the Severus tradition. The increase in wages and donations strengthens the bond between soldiers and emperor, but also creates growing expectations. Military service became increasingly central in the life of the empire, not only as an instrument of defense, but as a way of social promotion and integration. Many soldiers see the border not only as a place of danger, but also as a space of opportunity, where they can obtain rewards, lands, and prestige. This reality helps to explain the resilience of the Roman army, capable of sustaining prolonged efforts despite difficulties. Logistics, once again, proves decisive. Caracalla's campaigns show how fundamental the ability to keep troops supplied in difficult and often hostile territories is. Warehouses, communication routes, and river fleets are being upgraded and more closely coordinated. The Danube, in particular, is confirmed as a vital artery, not only for the movement of troops, but for the management of the entire defensive system. Control of the river allows Rome to compensate for the dispersion of forces and maintain an effective presence on a vast front. This intensive use of existing infrastructure represents one of the empire's strengths, but requires constant commitment in terms of maintenance and resources. Alongside the material aspects, a more subtle but equally important dimension emerges, the psychological one. Caracalla's campaigns contribute to strengthening the idea of an army always ready, always present, capable of striking across the border if necessary. This perception has a deterrent effect on the barbarian populations, but also serves to reassure the provinces. The border communities, while continuing to live in a precarious condition, perceive the Roman presence as more concrete and reactive. The border is no longer just a line to be defended, but a dynamic system, in which the initiative can pass quickly from one side to the other. However, this transformation is not without costs and contradictions. Strengthening the army means increasing the financial weight of the state, already burdened by growing expenses. The centrality of soldiers in political life makes the empire more dependent on their consent, creating a delicate balance between imperial authority and military power. Caracalla's campaigns, although effective in the short term, accentuate these trends, showing how border security is now inseparable from internal stability. Every military success strengthens the empire, but at the same time increases its vulnerability to future crises, should resources or leadership fail. Overall, the preparation and reinforcement phase that follows the main operations against Quadi and Carpi represents one of the most lasting results of the campaigns of 213–214. Even when the weapons are silent and the army reduces its offensive activity, the structures created, the consolidated habits and the tested strategies remain. The border becomes a permanent laboratory of adaptation, in which Rome refines the tools with which it will try to face the challenges of the century. Caracalla does not introduce radical reforms or inaugurate a new model of army, but accelerates a process already underway, making it more evident and more urgent. In this sense, his action must be read not only as a response to contingent threats, but as part of a broader transformation. The empire that emerges from these campaigns is still powerful, still capable of imposing its will, but it is also an empire that must fight more often, spend more, adapt continuously. The army, strengthened and prepared, is the instrument of this survival, but also the sign of a world that can no longer afford long pauses of peace. Caracalla's campaigns, seen from this perspective, are not just an episode of Roman military history, but a crucial step in the slow transformation of the empire into a state increasingly oriented towards the armed defense of its borders. When the most intense military activity subsides and the legions settle back into a posture of vigilance, the time of battle gives way to that of evaluation. It is in this moment, less spectacular but decisive, that the strategic consequences of Caracalla's campaigns along the Rhine and the Danube emerge most clearly. The war did not produce new borders, nor did it erase the presence of the barbarian peoples beyond the rivers, but it had a profound impact on regional balances, on perceptions of strength and on the very dynamics of the confrontation between Rome and its adversaries. The strategy adopted by the emperor and his commanders shows all its ambiguity, effective in the short term, expensive and intrinsically unstable in the long term. From the Roman point of view, the most obvious result is the recovery of the initiative. After years in which the incursions had given the impression of a border constantly under pressure, the empire demonstrates that it can choose the times and places of the intervention. The war was carried across the river, depriving the enemies of the security of their bases and interrupting the dynamic in which Rome always seemed forced to react last. This change has a strategic value that goes beyond individual clashes. It reestablishes a hierarchy, placing the empire back in the position of dominant actor, at least on a military level. For barbarian populations, the message is clear. Incursions are not without consequences and can provoke a devastating response. However, this newfound initiative does not translate into definitive control. Caracalla's campaigns do not aim, and probably cannot aim, at the structural elimination of threats. The Alamanni remain beyond the Rhine, the Quadi and Carpi beyond the Danube, and their societies are not destroyed, but only temporarily weakened. Rome consciously chooses not to permanently occupy territories that are difficult to defend and administer, preferring a strategy of active containment. It is a rational choice, dictated by the awareness of imperial limits, but which implies the acceptance of a potentially recurring conflict. The resulting peace is not a stable condition, but rather an armed pause. On a diplomatic level, the consequences are equally significant. The campaigns favor a fragmentation of the barbarian front. Some groups seek deals with Rome, offering hostages, loyalty, or military support in exchange for protection or benefits. Others, hit harder, are forced to reorganize, slowing down their offensive capacity. This division is one of the most effective tools of Roman border politics, which prefers dealing with separate adversaries rather than facing large, cohesive coalitions. However, this same policy contributes to making the picture unstable, because alliances are fragile, linked to immediate interests, and easily reversible. Within the empire, the campaigns reinforce the idea that security depends increasingly directly on the presence and efficiency of the army. The border provinces, although strained by logistical efforts and requisitions, benefit from a temporary reduction in incursions and a greater feeling of protection. Local elites, often involved in organizing supplies and supporting troops, consolidate their role as intermediaries between central power and territory. This strengthening of the military dimension, however, also accentuates the distance between center and periphery, making imperial authority increasingly dependent on the ability to maintain a strong and loyal army. Propaganda plays a crucial role in building the official budget of the war. The coins, honorific titles, and inscriptions celebrate Caracalla as victor and defender of the borders, emphasizing the subjugation of the Germans and the Danube peoples. This narrative is not a simple lie, but a functional simplification. It transforms a series of complex, fragmented, and often inconclusive operations into a clear and reassuring victory. For Roman public opinion, far from the front, this story is enough. For the soldiers, it is a recognition of their effort. For enemies, it is a warning, even if they know full well that the reality on the ground is more nuanced. Strategically, the campaigns of 213, 214 contribute to defining a model of intervention that will become increasingly frequent during the 3rd century. Not great conquests, but punitive expeditions. Not annexations, but temporary stabilizations. Not a lasting peace, but a continuous management of the conflict. This model reflects the transformation of the empire, which is no longer in an expansionary phase, but not in full retreat either. It is an empire that fights to maintain, not to grow, and which must do so on multiple fronts, with limited resources and growing expectations. From the point of view of barbarian peoples, the consequences are ambivalent. On the one hand, the campaigns demonstrate that Rome remains a formidable opponent, capable of inflicting very hard blows. On the other hand, they also reveal that the empire cannot afford a permanent and massive presence beyond its borders. This awareness fuels long-term strategies, made of waiting, adapting, and exploiting the internal Roman crises. The defeats suffered do not erase the demographic pressure, the economic needs, the internal dynamics that push these populations towards the border. Caracalla's war does not resolve these root causes, but postpones them. The overall strategic balance, therefore, is that of a partial success. Rome achieved what it set out to do: re-establish order, reduce immediate pressure, reaffirm its authority. But the price is high, and the results are by definition temporary. Every stabilization requires constant commitment, every withdrawal risks being interpreted as a sign of weakness. The empire emerges from the campaign more confident, but also more aware of the fragility of that balance that it can only impose through force. In this sense, Caracalla's campaigns represent a sort of silent watershed. They do not inaugurate the crisis of the 3rd century, but they clearly show its contours. The empire is not yet in irreversible decline, but it must now fight to defend what it possesses, and it must do so in an increasingly frequent and expensive way. The strategy adopted works, but does not offer definitive solutions. It is a permanent emergency management strategy, which requires present emperors, loyal armies, and abundant resources. When the legions stop and the front seems, at least for the moment, under control, there remains a certainty shared by commanders and soldiers: the war will return. Maybe not right away, maybe not in the same place, but he will come back. The campaigns of 213, 214 demonstrated that Rome is still capable of facing it and winning on a tactical and strategic level. However, they also showed that victory, in the world of the borders of the 3rd century, is never definitive, but always provisional, suspended between the present success and the next inevitable test. When the legions begin to reduce the pace of operations and the continuous movement that had characterized the previous months gives way to more stable surveillance, Caracalla's campaign enters its final phase not through a solemn act, but through the natural exhaustion of military pressure. There is no solemnly proclaimed treaty nor formal surrender of the enemies. What is consolidated is rather a new configuration of power relations, fragile but sufficient, for the moment, to guarantee the empire an armed truce. The borders of the Rhine and Danube remain where they were, but they are no longer the same places as before. The campaigns of 213, 214 left material and psychological signs. They changed habits, expectations, and strategies, both in Rome and beyond the river. From an operational point of view, returning to a defensive posture does not mean demobilization. The troops remain on alert, the forts continue to be carefully manned, the communication routes are kept efficient. The difference compared to the initial phase lies in the awareness acquired. The Roman army tested the fighting methods of its opponents in the field, tested its ability to move quickly from one front to another, and verified the limits and strengths of its organization. This experience is not dispersed, but absorbed into the daily practice of the border service. Commanders now know that stability depends on speed of reaction rather than mere presence, and that the border must be managed as a dynamic system, not as an immobile barrier. Caracalla, for his part, can present the campaign as an accomplished success. Immediate threats were contained, incursions reduced, Roman authority reaffirmed. The official narrative insists on this point, and not without foundation. The empire has demonstrated that it knows how to strike decisively, that it can coordinate complex operations and maintain political and military control of a vast area. For the emperor, the most important result is not only the stabilization of the borders, but the consolidation of his relationship with the army. The legions fought under his leadership, they benefited from his generosity, they saw in him a present and determined commander. In an era where the loyalty of troops is the key to power, this is political capital of incalculable value. Yet, beyond the official celebration, the final assessment of the situation invites a more cautious reading. The barbarian populations were neither eliminated nor definitively subdued. Alamanni, Quadi and Carpi remain autonomous actors, capable of adapting, reorganizing, and waiting for more favorable moments. The losses suffered, the villages destroyed, the leaders eliminated do not erase the structural pressures that pushed these groups towards the Roman border. Economic needs, internal dynamics, opportunities offered by the riches of the empire. The war imposed a pause, not a solution. Even for Rome, the campaign leaves a legacy of unresolved issues. Strengthening the army and defenses has a high cost, which weighs on imperial finances and the provinces. The centrality of soldiers in political life, further accentuated by Caracalla, makes the system more robust in the short term, but also more vulnerable to sudden crises. Every future emperor will have to contend with growing expectations, an army aware of its power, and borders that require constant attention. The campaign of 213, 214 does not create these problems, but makes them more evident, brings them to the foreground as structural elements of imperial life. From a historical point of view, Caracalla's campaigns are located in a transition zone. They no longer belong to the world of great conquests, but they are not yet the desperate defense of a retreating empire. They are rather the expression of a power that fights to maintain an increasingly difficult balance, using refined tools, but forced to do so with increasing frequency. In this sense, they anticipate many features of the crisis of the 3rd century without fully coinciding with it. The empire is still strong, still capable of imposing its will, but it must do so with an effort that cannot be reduced or suspended without consequences. Caracalla emerges from this experience as an ambiguous and complex figure. He is not a military genius nor a simple bloodthirsty tyrant, as hostile sources often portray him. He is an emperor who understands the centrality of the army and acts accordingly, who uses war as an instrument of government and legitimation. His campaigns do not solve the underlying problems of the empire, but demonstrate a remarkable ability to manage the crisis. In this sense, its actions must be judged not only on the basis of immediate results, but on coherence with the context in which it operates, a context in which war is no longer the exception, but an almost permanent condition. When the campaigns of 213 and 214 are observed centuries later, what is striking is not so much the exceptional nature of the events but their normality. Border clashes, punitive expeditions, strengthening of defenses, triumphal propaganda. All this will become increasingly frequent during the 3rd century. Caracalla's war is, in this sense, a clear photograph of an empire that resists, that reacts, that adapts, but that can no longer afford to ignore the fragility of its own balance. Caracalla's campaigns along the Rhine and the Danube do not mark the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, but they clearly reveal its new rules of survival. Rome wins, but must win often. It controls, but only as long as it remains present, imposes peace, but knows it will be temporary. In these border wars we glimpse an empire that is still powerful, still feared, but now forced to live in a state of permanent vigilance, where force no longer guarantees definitive security, but only the postponement of the next test.